Welcome to part 3, the future of the US-led international order of the 4th Tokyo Global Dialogue. This is the last session to conclude our discussions since yesterday. In this session, we'd like to focus, build on the discussions since yesterday about how we see the new era which is following the end of the post-Cold War era. And in the second part, we'd also like to discuss, in particular, the role expected of Japan in this context. For the time being, actually, to inform the audience, we are having a bit of technical issues with two of our speakers who are connecting from Australia, Mr. Green and Mr. Medcalf. We have all other speakers already connected, so we will start our discussion with these four present. So to start our discussion, I'd like to a bit set a scene. In our previous communications with the speakers, we wished them to address two distinct questions. One is whether they believe that the US-led free and open international order can be sustained, and depending on their views, how they can see what is necessary in their view to maintain this order and what are the challenges. And if their view is that this order may not be sustainable, then what might be the order that might replace such existing order? But before going into that question, let me a bit introduce the discussions we had so far since yesterday. Our kind of basic assumption by starting this debate was that the so-called post-Cold War era has come to an end. And on this point, we feel that there has been rather kind of good convergence of views about this fact that we are coming to the end of an era which has been called the post-Cold War era. On the other hand, when we are discussing about then how to call what to call the new era, and how to characterize this new era that we are in, there have been quite divergent views expressed on this subject. Some said that this is not a new Cold War, and some said that this kind of description of authoritarianism versus democracy may not even be accurate. So maybe by asking my first question to the speakers about whether they believe this US-led free and open international order is sustainable, maybe it might be helpful for all the speakers also to address the kind of preceding question of how to characterize the epoch we are in. So I'd like to invite the speakers to address this first question and the first assumption. So I'd like to now start, then I'd like to introduce the speaker in turn when I invite them to take up the floor. So the first speaker will be Professor Jia Qingguo of Peking University. Professor Jia, you have the floor.
Well, thank you very much for your kind invitation. I think this is a very important and timely topic. Is the US-led free and open international order sustainable? I think it's hard to say at this moment. What is clear is that the international order now has become less free, less open, and less stable. It's less free because protectionism has become a dominant trend in all countries, or in most countries, especially in the US, the leader of that order. It's we can see that the U.S. withdrawal from the TPP, its blocking of the appointment of new judges to the WTO appellate court body, its efforts to undermine the organization's ability to function, its unilateral imposition of high tariffs on imports from other countries, especially from China, and its frequent use of economic sanctions against countries with which it has a problem with. Instead of standing up and reject such kind of unreasonable practice, the developed countries, on the whole, have largely remained silent. As a result, the flow of capital and goods is less and less free. It's less open because exclusiveness has been replacing inclusiveness as a principle of international security governance. In the name of values and security, the US has doubled or redoubled its efforts to enhance exclusive, value-based military alliances and political blocs at the expense of the inclusive mechanisms of international cooperation. In this region, for example, the US has devoted much more resources and attention to strengthen its military alliances with Japan, South Korea, and Australia. And it has tried to develop new blocs like the Quad. As a result, the East Asian Summit, the primary regional multilateral security cooperation mechanism, has lost its steam. It's less stable because the world as a whole, becomes as the world as a whole becomes less free and less open. The world becomes more protectionist and more divided. International relations in the region have become more confrontational and dangerous. Yeah. Instead of shared prosperity, one finds countries fighting for their narrowly defined economic benefits. Instead of shared security, one finds countries competing for security advantages for themselves. Instead of cooperation in addressing various kinds of global challenges, one finds countries throwing blames at each other on various global challenges. As a result, the world has become a less promising and more dangerous place. No country is innocent in the process. I mentioned the US more than others because it is both the leader and also self-claimed leader and the largest stakeholder of this order. What are the major factors underlying these trends? A careful analysis leads us to find the following. First, insecurity about the change in balance of power in the world, especially with the rise of China. Second, the zero-sum approach to security on the part of many countries. The third is fundamentalist approach to values, especially the US. That explains the practice of exclusiveness, especially in the pursuit of international security. Fourth, the spillover of domestic politics. And fifth, the negative interactions between countries, especially now between China and the US. What can be done? I think first we should realize that despite all its flaws, the current international order or the post-war international order that was built upon by countries led by the US is still the best the humankind has ever created. Through established institutions, states champion universally accepted values and principles such as sovereignty, non-aggression, non-intervention in another country's internal affairs, human rights, rule of law, free trade, and the principle of both common and differentiated responsibilities. In general, states observe international laws and norms. The international order has offered platforms for states to air their frustration with world affairs, international arrangements and practices. It has also provided opportunities for states to discuss ways and means to address their pressing global issues. In part because of this, another world war has thus been avoided, and that's and also unprecedented prosperity has been achieved. So as a result, most countries in the world have a stake in the existing international order. Even the rising powers like China and India, which feel the world order is not given their voices and interests adequate attention and respect, only call for reforms rather than wholesale replacement of the existing order with another one. Second, we need dialogue and communication, not just between so-called like-minded countries, but also between and among others. Third, we need to resist the protectionist pressures at home and work together to repair and reinvent institutions to ensure that we enjoy huge benefits of free and international trade and investment. Fourth, we need to take a more balanced approach to security cooperation. In other words, in our pursuit of security, we need to make sure that others have security. Only by doing so can our own security be assured. Fifth, we need to reject an excessive ideological approach to international affairs. Sixth, the leaders of countries need to make greater efforts to inform and lead the public to do the right thing rather than trailing or following it. And finally, we need to fight against extreme views of nationalists, racists, and ideological fundamentalists. They are poisoning our relationship. If we can do all this, the current international order is definitely sustainable. That, of course, is a big if. In the real world, we may not be able to accomplish that. As a result, the best we can expect is that the current international order will persist amid continuous serious problems and crises. Let me stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Jia, for your quite succinct and quite clear message to all. For the proceedings, actually, we are just informed that there has been an electricity outage in Australia. That was why the two speakers who were supposed to join us couldn't do so. I understand they are now trying to join us. Yes, not yet. Are they now connected? Okay. So maybe, so Dr. Green and Professor Metcalf seem to be now connected to us. So let me, maybe for the sake of clarity of how we are proceeding, just recap the questions I'm asking to all the speakers. Actually, I'm dividing my original two questions into two parts. And we are now addressing the first part of the question, how you see the possibility to sustain the current US-led international order. And to add some background to that question, I briefly informed the speakers that in the discussions since yesterday, there was a kind of general agreement on the fact that we are at the end of the so-called post-Cold War era, but there have been quite different views about how to characterize the new era we are in. Some didn't agree to call it a new Cold War, or some questions about the being divided in blocks, and some contested the definition of authoritarianism versus capitalism, democracy. And actually, in Professor Jia's comment, actually, Professor Jia described the current situation less free, less open, and less stable. And a similar kind of description was also made earlier, saying that like the world is more fragmented and less predictable and stable. But I think I was quite impressed by Professor Jia's strong view that current international order led by the US is still the best ever created. And he also suggested this is based on universally accepted values. So he also enumerated several measures to maintain it. Maybe there may be different views on that. So Dr. Green, if you could now join us, you were supposed to be our first speaker. So if you could now start your remarks. So we are having Dr. Michael Green, Professor and CEO, U.S. Studies Center, the University. Oh, no, he's not yet connected. Okay, so we'll proceed with Mr. Sanjoy Joshi first. He is connected, we know. So Mr. Sanjoy Joshi, Chairman, Observer Research Foundation. So if you could start, please, Mr. Joshi.
Thank you, GIA, for having me here, and thank you for that introduction. I agree to a large extent with Professor Jia, but what I would like to know to step a little back and look at what is it that was part of the international order and how we've reached where we are today. I mean, the US-led international order, which the rapidly globalizing world with all its benefits had signed on to, was actually the promise of a rules-based international order. It was one that also had the promise of riding free and open markets to universal prosperity. It was a kind of a perpetual motion machine, which only required a set of universal rules as the fuel, and democracy as a preferred, not always existing, but preferred lubricant. See, unfortunately, perpetual motion machines are fantasy. So today we find this machine does lie gummed up in the workshed as hostage to trade wars and increasing strategic competition, which none of us can run away from. But the point is, the biggest challenge to this order did not come from outside. It came from within. And there, 9/11 marked a critical inflection point. I think that was a time the US allowed the intoxication of its unipolar moment to force it into some lethal strategic overreach, which came to a bruising end 20 years later on August the 15th, 2021. In between, of course, there was the economic crisis when the notion of globalization itself came under severe interrogation on the streets of the very capitals and financial centers that had been its primary advocate. Main Street was just up in arms against Wall Street. And then we come to the present, 1 year ago, 24th April 2022, where it has become even difficult to find the moorings of that order, if any such exists. Yes, as was, we heard in many sessions, global governance is far more fragmented, multilateral institutions increasingly compromised in a world which is very, very, very conflict prone today. Now, while there is a lingering recognition amongst everyone of the needs for a rules-based international order, the possibility of any reaching a consensus at present looks fairly remote. True, there are many nations, and I would count Japan and India amongst them. There are several middle powers across Southeast Asia, and there are a whole host of economically beleaguered nations that, given a choice, have no interest in engaging in geopolitical competition. These nations have a far greater stake in relying upon diplomacy, and which is led by multilateral institutions to manage these tensions. And as well, not just these tensions, but also the impact of the US-China trade war. But as multilateral institutions corrode, these nations increasingly find their choices constrained. So what do we have left? You see, many believe that the answer lies with gated communities of nations. We heard about this in this conference also. Gated communities of nations building the exclusive pool clubs that grant membership based on the reliability of cardholders. Minilateralism, we try to call it. Others there are who dream of a plutocracy of independent, globally connected financial subnational units that run global affairs out of a global capital, located somewhere maybe in the Swiss resort town of Davos. But in the final analysis, both frameworks are fatally flawed because the issues that confront us cannot be contained within these walls of trust, no matter how well we fortify these walls. Whether we fortify them with rules, norms, sanctions, protocols of trade, the real world will keep breaking in and shattering all our carefully constructed narratives and norms around us. So in a hyper-connected world, hyperventilating on Twitter 24/7, where all diplomacy gets conducted on Twitter most of the time, the business of governance has become far more complex. Various actors other than nation states are playing an increasingly oversized role. Now, these include transnational technology entrepreneurs, multinational corporations, globally networked NGOs, and a whole host of civil society organizations. See, it all began by outsourcing public services such as healthcare, education, transportation. But then the states graduated to now outsourcing national security and even the business of war to private contractors. PMSCs, they are called. And the link to 9/11 again is very clear. The wider conflicts engendered through that process, the shifting balance of power in West Asia, all led states to improvise. And as these actors have multiplied, there's a loss of primary control. We also see some of that happening in Ukraine. A loss of primary control, loss of sovereignty over key roles, and with that loss comes a commensurate ambiguity about accountability. Now, these are the deeper systemic processes at work, which are reshaping 21st century politics and economics. We are already in a place where the state is less the primary monolithic actor of yesteryears and more the veil, the curtain behind which the struggle to assign a narrative to various acts of omission or commission by disparate agencies take place. It is not that the state as a primary unit is in any danger of withering away, but as the state has gone on outsourcing some key functions away, it is burrowing deeper under a perpetually thickening layer of grapes and finery. And to conclude, I think we are still in Act 1 of this play. In Act 2, we're already seeing technology strive to substitute agency-led order and norms by commonly held anonymized protocols of finance, trade, commerce, and communication. So unlike science fiction, which you'd like to believe in, the intelligent machine age does not manifest itself as a know-all supra-intelligent being housed in the server somewhere. It is slipping and concealed behind a very Kafkaesque thicket of structures, forest of structures, agencies, and algorithms ordering and controlling the lives of both the governing and the governed, both sides. Now, how democratic versus how intrusive these protocols are going to be today is extremely difficult to predict. But we can see there are going to be intense negotiations and confrontations about these across many societies and between countries. Now, and these contests and confrontations are redefining the very basis of democracy in the developed and developing world. So people who say, yes, this may not be a battle between democracy and authoritarianism, there's a logic, there's a perverse logic to it also. And now finally, look at global trade figures, and you will see that we are in a position where geopolitics and geoeconomics seem to be inhabiting two completely parallel universes. Now, this cannot continue. Something has to give. A global pandemic has been followed by a blitzkrieg of sanctions that have disrupted supply chains and financial flows, played havoc with energy and commodity markets. And going ahead, economic stability and accompanying social, political cohesion across countries are going to be contingent upon jump-starting growth by reducing political tensions and reinvigorating economies. So yes, as Professor Jia said, we don't have a solution. But lacking resolution to the key drivers of the political tensions we are seeing in the world today, of which technology competition is becoming the driver, the realignment between geopolitics and geoeconomics promises to be a very slow and very, very painful process. Thank you. That is my 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Joshi, about your quite conceptual way of describing where we are, and particularly your point about not only limiting our discussions to nation, the state actors, but other actors which are influencing the transformation of this era. But your take about the kind of the fact that we are living in a more difficult, more fragmented world is something in common with the previous speaker. So now we are finally sure that Mr. Green and Mr. Metcalf are with us. So I excuse for repeating my introductory statement for the third time. I'll be quite short. So for Dr. Green and Professor Metcalf, we are informed that there was some electricity issue in Australia. So you are just joining us. So let me ask you, The first question that I wanted to ask about the sustainability of the US-led international order. And to that, if you could add your view of how to characterize the era we are in. There has been broad agreement that we are coming to the end of the so-called post-Cold War era, but there have been quite divergent views about how to characterize the current era. So, Dr. Michael Green, I hope now we can hear you.
My apologies, Sensei. In Sydney, Australia, there was a massive thunderstorm. I'm guessing where Rory is in Canberra, which is 3 hours drive away. Maybe the weather's okay, but we briefly lost the internet. So I guess the first thing I would say is we need to understand what the U.S.-led order was throughout the Cold War. And one very important fact is that at the beginning of the Cold War, when the United States was forming alliances with NATO and Japan in the period from 49 to 50, 51, the United States had 50%, half of all global economic output. And by 1970, it had 25%. In relative terms, it had dropped in half. So how is it that somehow the US-led order continued for the next period and even arguably today? I think one very important factor is that the United States used allies and partners and brought closer relations with key countries to maintain a favorable balance of power, favorable equilibrium. Japan and Germany, former enemies, joined into the US alliance system. After Vietnam, when US power and credibility were at stake, the Nixon administration and then the Carter administration opened up a new chapter with China and strengthened relations with Japan, of course, an ally, to restore a favorable balance of power. And as China's power began to grow, but I think more importantly, Chinese ambitions began to change in the 2000s and in the last few years, the US opened a quite dramatic new chapter in its relationship with India. So I think if you look at the US-led order entirely based on absolute or even relative American power, you miss something. This order is maintained because the American system, for all its flaws, accommodates powers that are not revisionist, that are not fundamentally trying to change that order. You know, Japan had a different view from the United States in 1951. China definitely had a different view in 1971. And as we just heard, India continues to have different views than the United States. But opening up these relationships restored an equilibrium and allowed the essence of the previous order to continue. So if you ask what the era is now that we are in, I think it's a chapter in which that game is more about multipolarity, not global multipolarity. Our Chinese friends often try to emphasize global multipolarity, where China is the most important pole in Asia. But I think if you look at the Indo-Pacific, what you see is within this region, there is very strong multipolarity emerging. You have simultaneously important and growing Chinese power and influence, but you still have continued and important American leadership and in many areas primacy. But you have increasingly the agency, the influence, the ambitions of Japan, of India, of Korea, Australia, Indonesia. Basically, all of the top economies in Asia after China are democracies, and all of them are tightening their relationships with the United States. Why? Because these countries, despite the differences, also want to maintain some stability, some stable equilibrium. They don't want revisionism and coercion. And ultimately, I think this new era is sustainable and in some ways is safer because the United States needs allies. The United States needs to listen to India. We did a survey at my center and we asked the American people if they support US alliances with Japan, Australia, and Korea, and the number was very high. It's always high these days. But when we asked why, the most interesting difference from 2 years ago is that Americans now say we need our alliances and partnerships, not to protect Japan or protect Australia or Korea. 60% of Americans say we need them to protect us because the alliances make us safer. And the United States has signed major deals to transfer nuclear propulsion technology to Australia, 5G and other technology to India. The US is building up the capability and enhancing the sovereign capability of these other countries. And for that reason, I think it's quite sustainable. But I also think it's healthy because Japan and Australia, Korea and India don't want a war with China. So I think the US reliance on these allies and partners ultimately will moderate some of the excitement in Washington about competition with China at the end of the day.
Thank you very much, Dr. Green, for giving us your succinct views just immediately after you could manage to join us. Actually, maybe in the later discussions, Professor Jha might also refer to it again, but it was interesting that before you could join, in his remarks, Professor Jha described the US-led order, international order, still the best ever created. So maybe we'll come back to that point later. And regarding Mr. Green's point, what was really interesting for me is his way of describing this particular Indo-Pacific as more multipolar. And the point that you made about it is kind of safer or more stable as alliances for Japan or the US allies in this region, because this dependence, interdependence is in a way deepening in this region, also for the benefit, not only for the protection or the defense of Japan or Australia, but also for the alliance, more two-way alliances, if I may call it. So I also hope that Professor Rory Medcalf could now join us. Professor Rory Medcalf, Head of College, National Security College at Australian National University. I hope you are also okay with your electricity supply.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be with the conference, and it's a great pleasure to be in Tokyo virtually. I look forward to being there in person again before too long. And yes, we had some weather issues here, but perhaps not as intense as in Sydney. Look, to distinguish my remarks from those of the two earlier very esteemed speakers, I might invoke another word, and that is, I guess, a hybrid of bipolarity and multipolarity. So let's just play with the word heteropolarity for a moment. That sounds a little bit creative and perhaps a little bit absurd, but to be quite serious, if I look at the global system at the moment, and I look at the system in the Indo-Pacific in this way, there are very strong elements of multipolarity, but there is a certain bipolarity as well. If you look at the military balance, if you look at where China and the United States stand in their ability to inflict or withstand pain using military means, they do stand apart from other powers in the region. I'll put Russia to one side in the global map, but in the Indo-Pacific, the US and China do dominate in that regard. However, if you look at the other dimensions of national power, if you look at technology, innovation, investment, soft power, diplomacy, ability for states to influence one another, to attract and repel, in fact, it is much more heteropolar. If you look at changes in demographics, if you look at not only the demographic, but the other measures of India's power, if you look at what Japan brings as a sustained major power, incredibly strong technology power with its own democratic strengths, of course, we look at a much more complex environment. So I guess to give that simple crystallization of that, I think it is more complex than bipolarity. It's more complex than multipolarity. It has elements of both. And the challenge for really the middle players, not middle powers, but the middle players other than the United States and China in how to navigate this is, I think, to ensure that the multipolar dimension of this, or the multipolar character of this region, is a stable multipolarity. And of course, there's a great international relations literature debate on whether bipolarity or multipolarity are more stable, and it depends. But I think there are ways in which we can make multipolarity a reasonably stable web. I think also the coalition building and I think the alliance and coalition building that Mike referred to in particular, is such that we can leverage the virtues of multipolarity to reinforce stability in the regional and global strategic balance. And that means, of course, not only the middle players self-strengthening, but also strengthening one another through the mini-lateral webs, the Quad being a great example, but trilaterals and other arrangements as well. And then finally, working with the United States to perhaps redefine what leadership means in this new environment. I like the fact that Mike alluded to the fact that American leadership, even for much of recent decades, was not solely or even primarily a function of America's share of global economy, or even, I think, America's share of military power, but it did speak to other normative dimensions. And I think even now, when we're looking at theories that the United States is declining and China is rising, and that there's some sort of weird inevitability about that, I think instead we should look in a more sophisticated way at the kind of leadership, the revised kind of leadership that perhaps the United States might bring. And I do think that under the Biden administration, we're seeing some quite good examples of that. Interesting question marks, troubling question marks about what that could look like under some future administrations in the United States. But let's take the America we have at the moment as the America we want to work with. I think redefining leadership to be something other than primacy, I think is a critical concept to bring into the conversation. I'm not the first to suggest this by any means, but there has been an interesting debate, often very subtle, within policy communities in Washington and elsewhere, that primacy is one thing, but perhaps some other objective preeminence, you might wish to call it, is another thing, which is about not needing to lead or dominate on every issue, but being actually much more agile in leveraging and building the partnerships and alignments that bring the rest of us more effectively into the picture, whether it's Australia, India, Japan, Southeast Asian partners, Korea, Europe. It's actually a very, very long list. So I guess just to conclude for the moment, this is an incredibly challenging and actually quite exciting time for diplomacy, because, of course, diplomacy is the only instrument by which we're going to achieve that more moderated and sustainable form of American leadership. And why I have some significant confidence that this can be achieved is that it's not as if another power is effectively filling a void. It's not as if there's some perfect substitution of, let's say, Chinese leadership for American leadership across the region. Many, even countries that were very troubled or found it difficult to work with elements of the Trump administration, want America in the Indo-Pacific. And having just returned from the South Pacific, for example, looking at the small island countries of the South Pacific, it hasn't actually been that difficult for the Biden administration to signal that America is back as a partner. So I hold out some optimism. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Metcalf. You talked about the more complex way how particularly the Indo-Pacific region is. And that may be a kind of good cautionary remarks by you about maybe all of us trying to label in a very simplistic way about this new era. And your discussion about multipolarity and the redefinition of the US leadership was also very good elements for the further discussion. So let's go over to Europe. And I'd like to invite Mr. Thierry de Montbrial, Executive Chairman, French Institute of International Relations, to give us views from his perspective. Monsieur de Montbrial, please. Mr. de Montbrial, your voice is not arriving us. Maybe you are still muted?
Is it okay now?
Yes, now we can hear you.
Okay, thank you very much. So first, I will try to give a oversimplistic answer to your question. We are right now living the real end of the Cold War with a hot war. In fact, the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, not from external forces, but from inside. It collapsed from the top. And after the collapse of the Soviet Union, followed 10 years of chaos in Russia. I have myself traveled extensively in the Russian Federation in the 90s. It was real collapse, and this is why at the end of the 90s, the Russian population wanted a strong man. We should never forget that. And since then, no new equilibrium was found within Russia and between Russia and the rest of the world. So now we are at the real end of the Cold War with a hot war. And that hot war, in fact, is the result of the confrontation of two incompatible visions, which is from the viewpoint of I would say, the West, and particularly the new Western members of NATO and the European Union. I am alluding to such countries as Poland and the Baltic states. The primary goal is to make sure that the Russian Empire will never be back to absorb them. And for that, they have the ideological support of many in the United States. You know that particularly the Polish population in the US is very important. Ukrainian population too in the US, and even more in Canada is very important, and it could continue the list. So on that side, the primary goal of these, what I call new members of the European Union and of NATO, wanted to make sure that Russia could never, when I say Russia, historic, not only the Soviet Union, of course, Russia could never absorb them as they did in the last few, since Peter the Great, essentially. So that's one vision, and the related to that, and I will come back on that point, the American prevailing vision just now with President Biden, that the US is the natural leader of a free world, meaning the new free world meaning the democratic world against the autocratic world. And this is, I think, the dominated vision today. Now, the opposite vision to that one is, of course, the Russian vision. I don't know what President Putin is saying just now, but that vision is that the special military operation that is in fact the aggression of Russia on Ukraine was in fact a defensive action from the Russian viewpoint, and a defensive action against what? Against, from the Russian viewpoint, the will of the US and the democratic coalition towards regime change, even if regime change is not has never been stated as such. So what we are living now is a real war, which is the end, and which should be, we will see with the result of this war, which is, of course, too early to say, but the end of the current Ukrainian war will probably be the real end of something which historically will remain as the Cold War. So from that viewpoint, we are in a transition period. And there is another transition period, which I will describe in a moment. But before going into that, let me say that I am a little puzzled by the title of this session, because that is the future of the US-led international order. In my judgment, there has never been such thing as a US-led international order. And if my memory serves me right, I think I made the point in Tokyo 3 or 4 years ago at a conference of the GIIA in person. Well, we had during the Cold War clearly a US-led Western order, but that Western-led that the Western or US-led Western order covered only one part of the world. You know, obviously not the communist part of the world, and not clearly the third world. You know, the concept of non-alignment, at the time we were less sophisticated. We didn't talk about multi-alignment, but essentially the idea that many countries did not want to be subjects of the US or subjects of the Soviet Union or subjects of China, the Popular Republic of China. This was a very important concept. And even during the first decade of this century, I think that it's not obvious that there was anything such as a US-led international order, because, as I just said, it was chaotic in the former Soviet Union in that first decade, and China was then concentrating on its own developments, which does not mean that China considered itself to be part of a really US-led international order. Clearly, their own interest to be able to develop as fast as possible, they needed to take the best of the existing arrangements, so to speak. But I would not call that an order. That's a conceptual point, which is very important. When we mean order, an order means an arrangement that is accepted by all parties as a long-term framework, you know. And when the fundamentals of a situation change, at some point, the existing so-called order is not sustainable. You have to adjust the situation. And this is exactly what happened in the second transition phase. That's why I think conceptually we have to distinguish two transition phases. And the second transition phase is dominated by the fact that China has progressively been recognized as moving toward the status of a superpowership. That India is now also moving in that direction, which means that quite apart from Russia, former Soviet Union, Ukraine, and so forth and so on, there is a new potential balance of power, which was not really discussed in the at the beginning of this century. So today, is, in fact, a double transition phase, a superposition of two waves of transition, which do not have exactly the same status, because on the one hand, you have the problem of declining powers who are fighting for survival and for consolidating what they consider to be the basics of their own security for the future, and on the opposite side, with the issue of rising powers who want to be recognized as what they are, namely key actors in the future international order, and at the same level, more or less, as the United States. And the United States is not ready to accept this change of status. For what I would say nationalistic reason in some sense, but also for ideological reason. And here I will use another concept that today is not recognized clearly in the West, particularly, which is the concept of heterogeneity. That's a word which is not easy to pronounce in English. But how to have an accepted, a worldwide accepted, heterogeneous international order is, I think, the key question of the coming years. By heterogeneity here, I am, of course, referring to ideological heterogeneity, the recognition that unless you buy an Hegelian view of the philosophy of history, we are not necessarily moving altogether towards the American conception or the Western conception of democracy. And that's a big question. So to conclude, I would say that we are, all of us, hesitating between two directions. One would be, and today it seems to be the prevailing view in the United States, one would be the consolidation of the Western world, Western in a large sense, that is including Japan, for instance, that is the consolidation of a democratic, an extension of a democratic order. And it is more and more the way the US and, I must say, many European countries define their support for Ukraine these days. But of course, if these words have a meaning, it means that NATO, for instance, would be transformed progressively as a broad alliance between, including perhaps extending perhaps to the security treaty with the US, or a connected system of alliances, aiming, designing, considering in fact their enemies to be all the autocracies in a wide sense, including China. So that is one conception, which I repeat today seems to be the dominating view in the West. And the alternative would be a sort of equilibrium in the Kissingerian sense. That is how to redefine a world order, acknowledging the fact that there are new great powers, essentially China, and perhaps at some point India, and who knows others, and to define rules of the game to make sure that the world can continue to be what I like to call reasonably open, certainly not as open as it was at the beginning of the century, but certainly less closed than it would become if we were moving towards hostile blocks, which is something which could happen. So today, I think, is impossible. It is impossible to describe an order which does not exist. No, we are in physics. We are used to discuss about the concept of phase transition. During a phase transition, there is no phase. There is a sort of more or less controlled chaos, and this is what we are today in. This is why I fully buy the concept of complexity. I think the complexity, as it was very well said, complexity does not allow to use in any useful manner words such as multipolarity, unipolarity, or whatever. And the most important common interest we have is to avoid this situation moving an even more chaotic state and possibly a much wider war that then could be called a Third World War.
Thank you very much, Mr. de Montbrial, for your very comprehensive description of how we should see the current moment and what directions or we might be heading, and two possible ways, and your challenge to the US-led international order. We may be able to discuss it later. So last but not least, Mr. Kenichiro Sasae, President of JAIA. So you are the last speaker.
Thank you, Ichikawa-san. The merit of speaking at the end of the speakers list is listening to all of you and try to select what you want to say. Listening to all of you, I think each one has its own views from each own perspective. The American colleagues, now Australian colleagues, Michael Green spoke about the relative decline of American power in terms of economic powers and multipolarity. I agree, all of this. And again, I agree with Robert Metcalfe's, analysis of it's more complicated. It's not simply multipolar. We have still bipolar emerging hegemon, one way or another, more military structure and possibly alliance structure. But in the economic terms, I think the Chinese ascendancy was more out of the existing American-led Western, I would say, order, but it was still the global order in terms of universality of the economic institution like WTO and others. So I think you can't simply define in one way. It's more complicated, as somebody said. But I detect the enormous perspective difference between our Chinese colleague. He expressed more of the concern and less open, less stable, and less cooperative, and so forth. And it looks like every problem was arising from U.S. leadership, one way or another. But wasn't there any problem on the part of Chinese leadership, if there is any? I mean, that's some of the things we are beginning to be more concerned these days. Of course, there is American problem, when it comes to economic protectionism. And some of the concern about, economic statecraft coming from China, and that is related to Chinese military ascendancy. You could define this as a simply, power struggle, but there is no rule of the game, as TL said it. And so I would say that we are coming into a very difficult period. But some of the things I was reassured was the fact that the Chinese colleagues said that China is still benefiting from the current international system. Basically, I think on the economic front, but I think that's worthwhile, confirming. I think the issue is more on how we would address the Russian problem and Chinese ascendancy issues. And on the first one, I was very much impressed with the TL definition. We are going from the end of the Cold War to the hot war, and this could be a transition period. But the question is, we really don't know where we are heading for. I think depending on how this would come out, I think this international order or American-led Western order, whatever you call it, could be collapsing. So that is an enormous danger. And for that, I share the concern. But when it comes to the regional order and hegemonic rivalry between the United States and China, I think there is still hope because one, I think China has still the stake in trying to keep the America following the free trade system. That's some of the things I agree with him. Of course, I think there is a lot of Chinese problem involving, especially Chinese protectionism one way or another. China is reacting to US, that is true, but inherent Chinese economic structure problems, that is also causing a lot of problems related to military build-up. So that things are real concern and regional concern. And also this concern about democracy versus, authoritarianism. Some people say that you can't really define this hegemonic, rivalry, the democracy versus authoritarians, but still it does matter because China is a big one. If China is a smaller developing country, we don't have to be so much worried about it. But the impact of that governance does matter to all of us because that is reflective of its external posture too. And so when China says that we shouldn't meddle with the domestic affairs, we shouldn't, but to the extent that concerns our own affairs, including principles of values, then I think we would like to say something to China without causing too much conflict and friction there. And I would stop here and possibly Ichikawa-san, you would go on.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sasai. For the audience, we are a bit behind the schedule, but please post your questions as we proceed with moderated discussions. So we did the first round of the discussions, and actually we are really behind the schedule. So, but in maybe just 2 minutes or so, if any of you would like to respond or jump in to comment on whatever was said after you spoke, or some of the questions that you might ask to other speakers, please just raise your hand in front of camera. Maybe then I will, Mr. Jai, yes, maybe responding to Mr. Sasai's question. So maybe if you could, maybe also if you could, just also combine your answer to Mr. Sasai's question to one question that we already received from the audience, because this member of the audience is asking about China's policy, particularly related to its global security initiative. it seems that China has released its new paper on that. So maybe with that paper in mind, or even without, if you could maybe comment on Mr. Sasai's point, and also to maybe comment on the China's policy regarding its global security initiative. Mr. Jia, please.
All right, thank you. I've heard a lot of great remarks, very insightful, and I've learned a lot. Let me make a couple of comments. First, I agree with theory that it's very misleading to talk about U.S.-led international order. Okay, in my presentation, I said the current international order was formed with countries, led by the U.S. At the time. So it's a lot of countries' efforts, but with the U.S. Leadership at the time. And over the years, it has waxed and waned. And I argued in different places that actually we see two understandings of international orders. And one is the Western understanding of international orders. That is the international orders liberal, free, and is a liberal international order. So it attaches a lot of ideological flavor to it. The other is what I call a secular international order, a secular interpretation of international order. That is a lot of people. That most countries subscribe to this kind of understanding of international order, which, in addition to stress on values such as human rights, democracy, and also sovereignty, rule of law, and these non-ideological aspect of the values. So it seems to me that the liberal international order has run into some problems, especially now. When you push a very excessively ideological, policy, you exclude others. You narrow your base in a way, and that doesn't serve U.S. or even Western purpose. But then the secular international order has also been under challenge by international interventions and also by Russia's conduct in Ukraine. So all these we need to reflect on what the international order. How we should deal with this kind of situation. We should appreciate the order we have, and at the same time try to make efforts to shore it up and revising it, reforming it according to the new circumstances. The second point is that China has its own problems. China has been one of the problems. China has risen too fast, to the surprise of many, and both the outside world and China are not used to it. Have difficult time to adapt to it. We should learn to accommodate each other during the process of during this process. For example, when you talk about China's military build-up, of course it has been growing up very fast. And China's economy has also growing up very fast. As a percentage of Chinese economy, China's GDP, China's defense spending is one of the lowest on a per capita basis also. But people are worried about it anyway because of the rapid growth of China's defense capabilities. And finally, China's recent global security initiative, I think, well, people should pay serious attention to it. China has been arguing that it is searching for security for all rather than security just for China. China is arguing that we should cooperate with each other rather than opposing each other. We should be inclusive. We should rather than exclusive in our cooperation. So there are many things that China has come up with, and of course, there are things that countries may not agree, but there are things that countries should agree. It's because in their interest, so they should reciprocate with similar kind of sentiments if they believe that it's the right thing to do. So let me stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Jia. Maybe regarding this point of so-called Western liberal order and its ideological flavor might be excluding others. On this comment, maybe Dr. Green, if you may wish to add something from the U.S., but now placed in Indo-Pacific point of view.
Yeah, I'll let my friend Rory Metcalf speak for Australia. Look, the competition geopolitically with China and with Russia clearly has an ideational or ideological dimension. I mean, one of the reasons Putin invaded Ukraine was to prevent it or any other former Soviet satellite state from entering the EU or NATO or what is clearly seen in Moscow as a liberal Western democratic order. And if you read Xi Jinping's speeches, there's clearly, since at least 2012, 13, an ideological dimension in US-China relations. That does not mean we're in a kind of bipolar world where there's a democratic camp and an authoritarian camp. It's nowhere near that simple, of course. It's very, very complex. I think speaking from US perspective, it's pretty straightforward that it's better for the United States when countries are well governed, when they have accountable forms of government, when there's women's empowerment, when there's anti-corruption. And I think this is something that a lot of countries can agree on. So if we make it too fancy and highfalutin, we lose actually an objective that I think a lot of countries in the world would agree on, which is it's better for all of us if states, particularly vulnerable states, are better governed. And then we can disagree whether you pressure them to have more democratic governance, whether you support through technical means anti-corruption, how you go about it. But I often felt like this is not a binary choice when you really think about what makes the region more stable, and particularly in the Pacific Islands, Southeast Asia, South Asia, which are caught in this geopolitical vice. They are caught in this competition. And if they are not resilient, if they're not well governed, it makes them much more, frankly, objects of great power rivalry. So I think we can agree, I hope, that fighting corruption and promoting women's empowerment, having more accountable government is good for the system. And that's, I think, that piece of it should not be ideological.
Thank you very much, Dr. Green. And Professor Metcalf would like to maybe speak from the truly Australian view.
Look, thank you very much, Director General Ishikawa. I guess to reinforce, but also vary a little from the points that Dr. Green just made, I would note that the objective for, and I won't say the democracies, but the objective for the diversity of nations that want effectively a rules-based order and an order based on principles of sovereignty and principles of non-coercion. In fact, it's not an impossible objective. We don't need to set the bar too highly for a kind of new equilibrium, because in many ways, and I'm thinking here from the perspective of a middle power like Australia, in many ways, we're not looking for a regional or a global order where our objective is US leadership. Our objective is not US leadership and it's not US dominance, but the objective is a stable equilibrium that respects the rights and interests of diversity of powers, that sort of heteropolarity that I spoke about, or the heterogeneity perhaps that our French colleague alluded to, and a more sophisticated and perhaps limited form of US leadership is one pathway to get there. Maybe not the only pathway. I still would argue it's probably the best pathway we have at the moment. But the objective here is not to, in my view, the objective is not to defeat or obstruct or thwart every single objective that authoritarian powers have, that whether today's China has or perhaps Russia has. In some areas, obviously, the aggression against Ukraine does need to be, in my view, thwarted and proven to be futile. But in many other areas, it's not that we want necessarily authoritarian powers to lose. It's just that we simply don't want them to win. And therefore, in other words, whether it's coercion against other countries, whether it's seeking some sort of regional dominance of their own, the objective instead is to set limits to that in ways that respect the rights and interests of the diversity of others. And that's where the menu of qualities, I think, that Mike Green just referred to. So, some countries may place a greater premium on liberal democracy, others may place a greater premium on their own pathways to development. But as long as we can build a loose coalition of those countries that place sovereignty and principles and predictability in their international behaviour first and foremost, and so you can include, for example, a country like Vietnam in that list, then we have the basis for a new kind of stable equilibrium. So I think as long as that idea of limited objectives is internalised in capitals like Washington, as well as Delhi, Canberra, Tokyo, Jakarta, then actually I think we're beginning to get somewhere.
Thank you very much, Mr. Medcalf. Dr. Montbrial is raising his hand, so we'll go to him, and probably Mr. Joshi may be also wishing to speak. So I think I'd like to go to Mr. de Montbrial and then Mr. Joshi and maybe to Mr. Sasae again. So Mr. de Montbrial, please.
Thank you. Does it work? Yeah. I have one short question to Chingo and one short question to Professor Metcalf. To Chingo, how can you solve the Taiwan problem, which has been stated repeatedly as a vital issue for China? How can you solve that problem in the foreseeable future without breaking the order, whatever the definition of the order is? Of course, I am alluding to the possibility of a comparison between Ukraine and Taiwan. My question to Professor Metcalf is a bit conceptual, but it's, of course, very elegant to say that we would like to have a leader who is not dominant. So you said we would like US leadership, but not US dominance. How do you do that?
Thank you very much, Mr. de Montbrial, for your questions. Actually, we may be running out of time. So first I'd go to Mr. Joshi and then to Mr. Sasae, and then Mr. Jha, Professor Jha and Professor Medcalf for short answers. Maybe all of you within 2 minutes, please. Mr. Joshi, please.
Thank you so much. Quickly, this is taking off from Professor Green, what he was saying. A rules-based international order does not necessarily mean that we either agree on all the rules or we may disagree also on the interpretations of the rules. So there are going to be differences between nations. But the fact is that the difference between countries which are aligned, which are aligned to this idea of having certain international rules, a certain international order, fundamentally means how are we going to engage with each other regarding these disputes, whether these interpretations or even the fundamental disagreement on rules, whether the rule exists on the laws of the sea or not. And as far as India is concerned, this is the way out. Even we have problems with China. Yes, we have a contested border with China. We resent attempts to revise that. We resist revisionist tendencies. But our first instinct is always to resolve issues bilaterally, have conversations, have diplomacy, not necessarily going to war over these issues. So ultimately, that I believe that if you're working towards an international order, the way forward has to be that. The way forward has to be good diplomacy, and good diplomacy which is not conducted on Twitter.
Thank you very much, Mr. Joshi, for your very concise answer and comments. So, Mr. Sasa, would you like to speak now, or would you like to speak at the end of all other speakers?
Okay, let me say a few comments on some of the points made by Professor Gier on this liberal order, ideological and rule of law, and all these propositions of security for all. The first one, is liberal order too much ideological and therefore not inclusive? Is that proposition right? I'm not quite sure because I think, of course, many different kinds of governance, from autocracy to democracy, and China is also defined itself as a democracy. So I think there is a different kinds, but I think important point is that we can't really abandon the mission to see every country has a free and open and democratized system. The point is that we recognize the difference, and the point is that we wish to see they are moving forward. For example, if you look at the Myanmar case, it's going backward. But from our point of view, Chinese governance is also going backward. That's the issues, I think. We are not talking about, all this system itself is really irreversible. Of course, it is hard for the outsider to define and even dictate. We can't do it. At the end, I think people there would define and make a decision. But the point here is that if most of the countries go to dictatorship, it's a very dark world. I want to be honest about it. Is rule of law, is that a problem? I don't think so. It's defined in United Nations charters. Both Russia and China are committed. All this respect for sovereign rights and all the stuff. So I think rule of law is not simply the Western making. I think it's a global institutional notions. And finally, security for all. This reminds me of the old Soviet proposal in the Cold War, when he had a problem with America and alliance network in the Pacific. He tried to disrupt. So let us have a security for all Asia Pacific. And that didn't really tick because I think there was fundamental distrust between us and they. I don't think that there isn't sufficient trust relationship. I think the issue is more on how we would trust that relationship before moving on the rhetorics.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sasae. Maybe you made a quite important point about kind of aspirational direction that we should be following, and also your point about more universally accepted or more common shared values or notions or global notions that we may be recognizing in this debate. So maybe I'll go back to Professor Jia and Professor Medcalf for your short answers, 2 minutes each, please. Professor Jia first.
First of all, the Taiwan question, how to resolve it. I think China's policy has been peaceful unification or reunification. China has never believed that the Taiwan has split away from China in a sovereignty sense. It's a result of the current division is political, resulting from the Civil War. As long as we develop peaceful economic, social relations, I think China hopes that eventually, politically, we will have unification. But the problem is there are people in Taiwan trying to promote independence, trying to split the island province away from China. And also such kind of activities have been endorsed and supported by certain elements in the U.S. So we have a problem. Now the DPP, the ruling party in Taiwan, has its party platform is Taiwan independence. And the U.S. government has been supporting Taiwan. So we are facing a situation. Okay? I think we are at a critical stage. If somebody tries to steal Taiwan away from China, China has no alternative but have to fight. Okay, I think what are likely to happen if the current situation continues. In terms of military, maybe we'll have resumption of hostilities in the Taiwan Strait. And in terms of China-U.S. relationship, I'm seeing a possibility of downgrading and even severing of diplomatic relations if things go from bad to worse. I don't think that's something that serves the interests of anyone. But the U.S. appears to me has a problem of restraining the pro-Taiwan politicians. And they are constantly poking into the eyes of the Chinese with the Taiwan issue. That's very dangerous.
Thank you very much, Professor Jia, for responding to this very complex question in a very succinct manner. So, Professor Medcalf, if you may wish to comment.
Thank you. Look, I think Thierry's question was excellent because, of course, can you have leadership without dominance? And I would argue that we need to move in that direction in encouraging our American friends to set a realistic and stabilising objective in the Indo-Pacific. Look, I think we can move in that direction. I think that it's probably not for me to comment on, for example, the structures and operations of NATO, but in that alliance context, of course, there's certainly been efforts by many partners to work with the United States to build, I guess, a sense of leadership without dominance. But in the Indo-Pacific, I think there's about three elements. One is developing genuinely shared strategy. So in other words, not having simply an American strategy that allies like Japan and Australia are expected simply to plug into. There's very much a need to build shared strategic objectives and shared understandings for execution of strategy. And in fact, I think it's worth noting that in some ways, in encouraging the US to be a leader in the Indo-Pacific, it's been the allies that have encouraged America back in. If you look at a lot of the countering coercion in the past 7 or 8 years, there were moments where countries like Australia and Japan actually were taking a lead in encouraging the United States. Two last points. One is that the efforts by the United States, for example, to strengthen partners and allies, the whole story of the US-India relationship of the past 20 years, the very conscious effort, explicit effort that people like Condoleezza Rice had to help make India a major power in the 21st century was, in my view, about actually reducing the potential for American regional dominance by bolstering a partner that would be in some ways, well enough disposed towards the United States. And even if you look at AUKUS today with Australia, you could argue there's actually an element of that as well. But the big question mark is, how does the American political class approach this different way of thinking about leadership? And I do think that it's much easier for a very sophisticated American official, whether it's someone like you, Mike, or colleagues that you know in the administration today, to articulate an idea like this, like limited preeminence. It's much harder if you're a member of Congress or if you're a presidential candidate to sort of twist your rhetoric in that direction. But I think that's something that we need to encourage.
Yes, thank you very much, Professor Metcalf. Actually, we have run out of time for this session. Due to a bit of technical issue at the beginning, maybe we could not dig deep enough for our discussion, deep enough for this session. But I think from what I heard personally, at least in this session, the theme of the session and how to define where we are and where we are heading. Of course, this is a big question, and for that, we need maybe many more sessions like this to really come to more deeper understanding of the current situation and the way ahead. But the fact is that having this kind of conversation among such distinguished panelists and seeing where we are kind of agreeing, disagreeing, is always something we can build on. So that is really the purpose of this Tokyo Global Dialogue, and we really appreciate the time of all the speakers for this session. Thank you very much. This concludes this last part of this Tokyo Global Dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you.